Welcome back to In the Word, and we're starting a new week, book number 28. So, great job on reading through the Old Testament. Over the next few weeks, a couple of weeks really, we're going to be going through some very short uh, prophetic books. These are called the minor prophets because they are short. So, that's what we'll be finishing up with, is these minor prophets. Today, we're going to be looking at Hosea. Hosea may be a little disorienting for you when you start reading it for a number of reasons. First of all, the prophets we've looked at up to this point, for example, Isaiah and Jeremiah, they were focused on the southern kingdom of Judah. Ezekiel and Daniel, and Lamentations for that matter, were to a audience in the exile. Hosea is looking at the northern kingdom. He's one of two prophets to the northern kingdom, Hosea and Amos. And he's also prophesying before, so we'll see he's in the 500s, 700s. We'll see that in the first couple of verses. So we're going back in time to just before and just after the exile of the northern kingdom. So get your mind around that. We're talking to the northern kingdom just before their exile, no longer to Judah or the people in exile already. So that's how this book fits. It's also a little shocking when you start the book. The prophet is told to go marry and have children with prostitutes. And God is using this marriage and this prophet to demonstrate how unfaithful his people are and how faithful he is. So that's what we see in, if you want a broad outline of the book, chapters 1 through 3 are about an adulterous wife and a faithful husband. Chapters 4 through 14 is about adulterous Israel and a faithful Lord. So that's the big picture of the book. Let's get into these first 4 chapters. Again, the first 3 chapters are about an adulterous wife and a faithful husband. And these are demonstrations. So I've labeled the first chapter Demonstration of Rejection. Begins with an introduction in chapter 1, in verse 1, that orients us toward the time that Hosea is prophesying. He names several, just one northern king, and the rest are southern kings, kings from Judah. And this, when you go through these kings and you go back to First and Second Kings particularly, and try to orient who he's speaking to with the years they were reigning, you'll see that he was speaking for about 28 years, about 30 years, from 753 to 715 BC. It's 129 years before the exile of Judah. And of course, the northern exile happened in 722. So it happens about during Hosea's lifetime. So verse 1 is an introduction. And then starting in verse 2 and going to verse 9 is about an adulterous wife and her offspring. So it's shocking. It's meant to shock. It's meant to get attention. The prophet was speaking for God, and it was just as shocking that Israel would apostatize and turn away from their Lord as it is for the prophet to marry a prostitute who continues in her prostitution. So in these verses then, you'll see it goes back and forth between what's going on in Hosea's marriage and the comparison to the kingdom, to the northern 10 tribes. For example, in verse 2, he talks about the Lord spoke through Hosea. The Lord said to Hosea, go take to yourself a wife of whoredom and have children of whoredom. Why is that? It says, for the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord. So again, he's drawing an analogy between Hosea's marriage and Israel's marriage to him, those northern tribes. He says in verse 4, I'll punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel. This is looking back to 2 Kings 10, where Jehu gathered the sons of Ahaz and had them murdered. So he's making a comparison there, had them killed. He's going to bring blood on that house because of that. God is turning away from his people. I will no more have mercy on the house of Israel to forgive them at all. We've seen this before, that at some point God's mercy, his patience runs out. He resolves that he's going to bring judgment, and that's what we see here. Then beginning in verse 10 of chapter 1 and going through verse 1 of chapter 2, we see what the prophets often do. They have a message of condemnation with an assurance that gives hope. So hope that there's going to be not just a near-term judgment that's coming, but a long-term restoration. Look how verse 10 begins. In the ESV it starts, Yet the number of the children of Israel shall be like the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured or numbered. Again, this was a recollection of God's promise that he was going to take that nation and make them as numerous as the sand in the sea. They shall be, and in the place where it was said to them, You are not my people, it shall be said to them, children of the living God. So he's given them not only certainty about the near-term judgment that's coming on them, but the same God who's promising this near-term judgment has also promised to bring them back into the land, and he's assuring them he will do that. Chapter 2 then is a chapter about correction. Again, we're still in this section about Hosea's marriage. And it begins with basically a lawsuit, a covenant lawsuit, a marriage lawsuit, or a confrontation, you could call it, over the sin of adultery. And those first verses 2 through 7 talk about, and in explicit terms, the adultery that Hosea's wife is guilty of, and by analogy, God's view of the spiritual adultery of Israel. Look at verse 2, for example. Plead with your mother. Plead, for she is not my wife, and I am not her husband. So he's saying, essentially, he's forsaking her. That she put away her whoring from her face and her adultery from between her breasts. So he's saying, plead. Plead with Gomer, plead with his wife that she do that. Then we see God's compassion and this Hosea's compassion beginning in verse 8 and going down to verse 13. He's been taking care of her, he's been caring for her, even though she did not acknowledge it. And again, we see the analogy with Israel, that God was protecting them, God was being patient with them, God was holding back his wrath and caring for them, even though they did not acknowledge it. And that was what we see here. She did not know that it was I who gave her the grain, the wine, and the oil, and who lavished on her silver and gold, which they used for Baal. So again, the language goes back and forth between Hosea's wife and Israel. All these blessings that God poured out on Israel, they used it to worship idols. And this is why God is going to bring judgment on them. Starting in verse 14 then, we have a section here that has to do with restoration. So verses 14 through the end of the chapter is about restoration. And you can see it opens with an appeal in verses 14 and 15. Behold, I will allure her, I will draw her in. In other words, he's going to woo his wife back to him and bring her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her. So again, we see the parallel here with what happened to Israel. They sinned against the Lord. He punished them. He took them into the desert and cared for them there, spoke tenderly. That's talking about God's care for them. Gave her vineyards, made the valley of Acre a door of hope, again, bringing them into the land. So he's appealing to them. And then starting in verses 16 through 18, it talks about purification, that he's going to take his adulterous wife, or in this case, the adulterous people, which is the bigger picture, and he's going to purify them. He says, I will remove the names of the Baals from her mouth, and they will be remembered by name no more. So this again is alluding to that time when Jeremiah 31 through 33, God's promise to, his new covenant promise to purify his people and give them a new heart. That's being alluded to here, I think. Then he's going through this process. First, he woos his wife back to him. He purifies his wife in 16 through 18. And then he betroths her again in 19 through 20. He recommits himself to marriage in 19 through 20. And then 21 through the end of the chapter is this marriage, this union that comes back to him. I will have mercy on no mercy, and I will say to not my people, you are my people, and he shall say, you are my God. And again, here is the restoration, the marriage union back together. I'll point out as well that what he says in verse 22, the earth shall answer the grain, the wine, the oil, and they shall answer Jezreel. Well, Jezreel earlier was a place name. Here it's a Hebrew word which means that God will plant or God will sow. So in other words, what he's saying here is that part of this marriage and restoration is a recognition that of his goodness to them, of his goodness to care for them and provide them with what they need. And then verse 3 closes this section. I call this acceptance. So we see this, God is saying to Hosea here to act with grace toward this adulterous wife. Go again, love a woman who is loved by another man and is an adulteress, even as the Lord loves the children of Israel, though they turn to other gods and love cakes of raisins. So these other gods and cakes of raisins, this is talking about not only the idols, but the worship of them. Eating these cakes of raisins in their presence was an act of worship. So he's commanding him, go take that wife back, just as God in his grace will take back Israel. And then we see that he does it. He follows through on it. This is grace demonstrated. He says, I bought her for 15 shekels of silver and a homer and a lethek. I'm not sure what a lethek is. You might want to look that up and send me a note and tell me. But lethek of barley. And he said to her, you must dwell with me as mine for many days. Don't play the whore or belong to another man, so I will also be with you. So here's this demonstration of grace, buying her back. In New Testament terms, we call that redemption. And then he calls her to be holy. Again, in New Testament terms, we call that sanctification. We are redeemed and then called to be holy as a people, just as God is doing to his nation here. And then finally, at the end of verse 3, or chapter 3, verses 4 and 5, this is the grace promised. The children of Israel shall dwell for many days without king or priest, without sacrifice or pillar, without ephod or household goods. So he's talking about the time of the exile here. Afterward, the children of Israel shall return and seek the Lord their God and David their king, and they shall come in fear to the Lord and to his goodness. And you've seen this term over and over, in the latter days. So Hosea here is looking from the exile that's coming yet to the last days when Jesus comes and establishes his throne. We've already talked about in the book of Daniel about David reigning as well. So that's chapter 3. Closes out this section in Hosea that's about his wife. Now we're turning to Israel, adulterous Israel and a faithful Lord. And again, we have this charge that's brought. So you see the parallel. Hosea brought a charge against his wife. God is bringing a charge against Israel. Charge is, there is no faithfulness or steadfast love nor knowledge of God. They've forgotten God. You know, I've pointed out before, and I'll point it out again, I'm sure, as we go through the Bible, that sanctification begins in our mind Begins with remembering God. And then in verses 4 through 10, we see this, we see this large section here about the cause and the results. It starts out in verses 4 through 10 about the priests being indicted here for their failure to lead the people. And then that results in verses 11 through 14, an indictment of the people. The priests have led them astray. They've gone astray, and they're indicted. And then in verses 15 through the end of the chapter is a warning. He's calling Judah to pay attention to what's happening in Israel and take warning from it. So, brothers and sisters, may none of us be found to be spiritually adulterous. May none of us be found to be taking advantage of the Lord and His blessings and using them to pursue essentially other gods. Maybe not gods like Baal, but gods of leisure, gods of prosperity. May we instead be found faithful to our Lord. God bless you. Enjoy the book of Hosea.